we're going to Cuba, then Argentina, two nations with rich histories and complex political landscapes. But first, a little history. Batista, Castro, Galtieri, three names that have shaped the destinies of their countries. These are names that echo through Latin America's tumultuous past. Dictators, strong men, figures who wielded immense power, each left their mark in blood. Their reigns were marked by violence and upheaval. They seized power, promising order and prosperity. They spoke of grand visions and national pride, but they delivered oppression and misery instead. Their stories are brutal, complex, and full of contradictions. They promised much but gave little. Fulgencio Batista, a former soldier, ruled Cuba twice. His first rule began in the 1930s. First in the 1930s, when he rose to power through a military coup, then again in the 1950s, when he returned to power with the support of the United States. He was chummy with the American mob. Casinos boomed, the poor got poorer, the gap between the rich and the poor widened. Fidel Castro, the fiery revolutionary, overthrew Batista. He led a movement that promised change. He promised a socialist paradise, a new dawn for Cuba. He ruled with an iron fist for decades. His regime was marked by both social progress and severe repression. Leopoldo Galtieri, an Argentine general, took power in a coup. He was a man of military might. He led his country into a disastrous war with Britain over the Falkland Islands, a conflict that ended in defeat and disgrace. These men were products of their time. The Cold War raged. Superpowers vied for influence. Latin America was its battleground, a region caught in the crossfire of global politics. They were driven by ambition, ideology, and paranoia. Their actions were often ruthless. They left behind legacies of violence and repression. Their rule brought suffering to many. Their stories are cautionary tales, reminders that power corrupts, and that unchecked power can lead to tyranny, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Their downfalls serve as lessons for future generations. Havana in the 1950s, a city of contrasts where the old world charm met the new world opulence. A playground for the rich and powerful, where fortunes were made and lost in a single night. American tourists flocked to its casinos and nightclubs, drawn by the allure of exotic entertainment and the promise of endless pleasure. The streets throbbed with music and rum, a constant celebration that masked the underlying tensions, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The glitz and glamour couldn't hide the growing discontent among the Cuban people. Batista, a one-time sergeant, had seized power in a coup. His rise to power was swift and ruthless. He was a master manipulator. Ruthless and corrupt, he ruled with an iron fist. He lined his pockets while the masses struggled. Batista's regime was brutal. Political opponents disappeared. Torture was commonplace. The cries of the oppressed echoed through the streets. The US government, obsessed with containing communism, turned a blind eye. They saw Batista as a necessary evil. Batista was their man in Havana, a reliable ally in a region teetering on the brink of ideological warfare. A bulwark against the red tide. His regime was seen as a fortress against the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere, but his days were numbered. The facade of stability was crumbling, and the people's patience was wearing thin. In the mountains, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro was gathering his forces. The winds of change were beginning to blow, and a new chapter in Cuba's history was about to be written. Fidel Castro, a lawyer turned guerrilla leader, he rallied the dispossessed, promised them land, bread, and freedom. His message resonated. The people were ready for change. Castro's ragtag army, the July 26th movement, launched a daring attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. It failed. Castro was captured, imprisoned, then exiled. But exile only fueled his resolve. In 1956, Castro and a small band of revolutionaries, including Che Guevara, landed in Cuba aboard the Granma yacht. They waged a guerrilla war against Batista's forces. The people rallied to their cause. On New Year's Day, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. Castro had triumphed. Castro's victory was hailed as a triumph for the downtrodden. He promised a socialist utopia. He delivered on some promises. Healthcare and education improved, but his regime became increasingly authoritarian. Dissent was crushed. Political opponents were imprisoned or executed. Thousands fled the island, seeking refuge in Miami. Castro aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union. This brought the world to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The US imposed a trade embargo on Cuba. It crippled the island's economy. Castro's Cuba became a symbol of both revolutionary zeal and Cold War paranoia. It remains a complex and contested legacy. Section 5, Galtieri, the General's Gamble, Argentina in the late 1970s. A country in turmoil, economic chaos reigned, political violence escalated. The military, seeing itself as the nation's savior, seized power in a coup. General Leopoldo Galtieri, a career soldier with a hawkish reputation, emerged as the junta's leader. He promised to restore order and national pride. Galtieri's regime was brutal. It waged a dirty war against its own citizens. Thousands of students, intellectuals, and activists disappeared. Torture and murder were commonplace. The world looked the other way. Galtieri, desperate to distract from his domestic problems, made a fateful decision. He invaded the Falkland Islands. Section 6, the Falklands Fiasco, a war for nothing. The Falkland Islands, a windswept archipelago in the South Atlantic, known for its rugged terrain and remote location. Despite its isolation, this small group of islands has been the center of a major geopolitical conflict. A British possession since the 19th century, the Falklands have long been a symbol of British colonial reach. The Union Jack has flown over these islands for generations, marking them as a distant outpost of the British Empire. Argentina, however, had long claimed sovereignty over the Falklands, referring to them as the Islas Malvinas. The dispute over these islands has been a point of national pride and contention for the Argentine people. In April 1982, Argentine forces landed on the islands. They met little resistance from the small British garrison stationed there, quickly taking control of the territory. General Leopoldo Galtieri, the Argentine military leader, believed Britain would not fight for such a distant outpost. He miscalculated the resolve of the British government and its people. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, determined to defend British sovereignty, dispatched a naval task force to reclaim the islands. The decision was met with widespread support in the UK. Thus, the Falklands War had begun. It was a conflict fought over a small, remote territory, but it held significant political and nationalistic importance for both nations. It was a short, sharp conflict, characterized by intense battles and significant loss of life on both sides. The war showcased the determination and military capabilities of the British forces. Argentina's poorly equipped and trained troops were no match for the well-prepared and highly motivated British forces. The disparity in military strength was evident from the outset. Within weeks, the islands were back in British hands. The Union Jack was raised once again, signaling the end of the conflict and the restoration of British control. Galtieri's gamble had backfired spectacularly. The defeat was a major blow to his regime, leading to widespread protests and his eventual downfall. He had led his country into a humiliating defeat. The junta was discredited, and the war paved the way for the return of democracy in Argentina. The conflict, though brief, had lasting repercussions for both nations. Section 7, Scars of Dictatorship, Human Rights Abuses, Batista Castro Galtieri. All three men ruled through fear and repression. They silenced their critics, crushed dissent. They left behind a trail of human suffering. In Cuba, Castro's regime imprisoned thousands of political prisoners. They endured torture, starvation, and forced labor. In Argentina, the military junta disappeared an estimated 30,000 people during the Dirty War. They were abducted, tortured, and murdered. Their bodies were dumped into the ocean or buried in unmarked graves. These atrocities left deep scars on the national psyche. They serve as a chilling reminder of the human cost of dictatorship. Section 8, The Price of Power, Legacies of Brutality. Batista's legacy is one of corruption and brutality. His regime paved the way for Castro's revolution. Castro's legacy is more complex. He improved healthcare and education, but he also established a one-party state. He suppressed dissent and violated human rights. Galtieri's legacy is one of reckless militarism and human rights abuses. His disastrous Falklands War hastened the end of military rule in Argentina. These dictators left behind a legacy of authoritarianism, human rights abuses, and economic stagnation. Their actions continue to shape the political landscape of Latin America today. Section 9. Echoes of the past, lessons unlearned. Have we learned the lessons of the past? Sadly, the answer is often no. Dictatorships still plague many parts of the world. Power still corrupts. Human rights are still violated in the name of ideology, security, or greed. We must remain vigilant. We must speak out against injustice. We must support democracy and human rights wherever they are under threat. The struggle for freedom is never ending. It requires constant effort and vigilance. We must never forget the victims of dictatorship. We must honor their memory by fighting for a more just and equitable world. Section 10. Freedom's flame, a flicker in the darkness. The stories of Batista, Castro and Galtieri are grim reminders of the human capacity for cruelty and oppression, but they also offer a glimmer of hope. The human spirit is resilient. Even in the darkest of times, there are always those who resist tyranny, who fight for freedom and justice. Their courage should inspire us all. The struggle for a better world continues. It's a fight worth fighting. Even if it's just one plate at a time, one neighborhood, one city, one country, we can make a difference.